In the early years of the Third Reich, as Nazi banners unfurled across Germany and the machinery of dictatorship roared to life, Adolf Hitler was not only waging war against political opponents, racial enemies, and foreign powers. He was also fighting a shadow war, one against what he believed were secret, invisible forces manipulating the world from behind closed doors. Among the most feared of these imagined enemies were the Freemasons. To the Nazi mind, Freemasonry was not merely a fraternal organization. It was portrayed as a sinister, international conspiracy, one allegedly linked to Jews, liberals, capitalists, and Democrats, working in secret to undermine Germany from within. Nazi propaganda claimed that Masonic lodges were covert command centers of a global plot, pulling strings behind governments, financial systems, and even revolutions. This obsession would trigger one of the most systematic campaigns of cultural looting, repression, and erasure in modern European history. Across Germany and occupied Europe, Masonic lodges were raided, their archives seized, their treasures stolen, and their members hunted down. Ancient regalia, ritual objects, libraries, artworks, and membership rolls were confiscated, some destroyed, others hidden away in secret Nazi collections. This is the story of how the Nazis declared war on Freemasonry, why they feared it so deeply, and how the looting of Masonic lodges became part of a broader ideological crusade to control history, knowledge, and memory itself. To understand why the Nazis targeted Freemasons with such intensity, one must first understand what Freemasonry actually was and what it was not. Freemasonry originated in Europe during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, evolving from medieval guilds of stonemasons into a fraternal organization dedicated to moral philosophy, symbolism, charity, and self-improvement. By the 18th century, Masonic lodges had spread across Europe and the Americas, attracting members from all social classes: artists, merchants, military officers, scientists, politicians, and intellectuals. Freemasonry emphasized values such as tolerance, rational thought, personal responsibility, and fraternity beyond religious or national boundaries. Lodges often encouraged debate, education, and civic engagement. For authoritarian regimes, these principles alone made Freemasonry suspicious. But secrecy played a major role as well. Masonic rituals, symbols, and internal structures were deliberately private. While not sinister in intent, this secrecy allowed conspiracy theories to flourish, especially in times of social upheaval. By the early 20th century, Freemasons were already banned or restricted in several authoritarian states. Dictators feared any organization that operated independently of state control, particularly one that fostered international connections and loyalty to abstract moral ideals rather than absolute obedience to the nation or its leader. Adolf Hitler's worldview was shaped by paranoia, conspiracy thinking, and a deep belief that Germany's defeat in World War I had not been caused by military failure, but by betrayal from within. In this narrative, Freemasons featured prominently. Hitler absorbed anti-Semitic and anti-Masonic ideas from far-right writers, nationalist groups, and conspiracy theorists active in post-war Germany. These circles promoted the myth of a Judeo-Masonic conspiracy, claiming Jews and Freemasons worked together to destroy nations, weaken traditional values, and impose liberal democracy on the world. In Mein Kampf, Hitler repeatedly alluded to secret forces undermining Germany, associating Freemasonry with internationalism, pacifism, and republicanism, all enemies of Nazi ideology. He viewed Freemasons as agents of cosmopolitanism, promoting equality and humanism in direct opposition to Nazi racial hierarchy. To Hitler, Freemasonry was dangerous not because of what it did, but because of what it represented: an alternative system of loyalty and belief that competed with absolute devotion to the Führer. When the Nazis seized power in 1933, Freemasons quickly found themselves in the regime's crosshairs. Although Freemasonry was not immediately outlawed, pressure mounted rapidly. Nazi propaganda newspapers and posters accused Freemasons of treason, corruption, and collaboration with Jews. Former lodge members were publicly shamed. Government employees were forced to declare whether they had ever belonged to a lodge. Membership alone could end a career, or worse. By 1934, the crackdown intensified. Masonic lodges across Germany were forcibly dissolved. Their buildings were seized by the state or handed over to Nazi organizations such as the SA or SS. Ritual halls were stripped bare. Libraries were confiscated. Lodge treasuries were emptied. Freemasons were pressured to sign declarations renouncing their affiliation. Those who refused were arrested, dismissed from employment, or sent to early concentration camps like Dachau. The destruction was systematic and ideological. As Nazi forces moved against Freemasonry, they did not merely shut lodges down, they plundered them. Across Germany and later in occupied Europe, Masonic temples were raided by the Gestapo and SS. Officers meticulously cataloged lodge possessions: ceremonial aprons, jewels, swords, banners, tracing boards, ancient manuscripts, rare books, portraits, and furniture. To the Nazis, these items were more than property, they were evidence. Proof, they believed, of a secret world conspiracy. Thousands of Masonic artifacts were seized and transported to central repositories. One of the largest collections ended up under the control of the SS, which planned to use the materials to study Freemasonry as an enemy ideology. Some items were destroyed outright, especially symbols considered degenerate or offensive. Others were looted for personal gain by Nazi officials. Gold and silver regalia vanished into private hands. Valuable books were absorbed into Nazi libraries. Entire lodge histories, records spanning centuries, were erased overnight. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Nazi campaign against Freemasonry was how obsessively the SS sought to study it. Under Heinrich Himmler, the SS developed a pseudo-academic interest in enemies of the Reich. Jewish texts, Masonic rituals, occult writings, all were collected not to understand them honestly, but to weaponize them ideologically. Masonic archives were centralized in places like Berlin and later, hidden in castles and monasteries across occupied Europe. SS researchers dissected lodge rituals, symbols, and histories, attempting to prove that Freemasonry was part of an ancient, global plot against Aryan civilization. This grotesque inversion of scholarship transformed stolen cultural heritage into propaganda tools. Freemasonry, once a fraternity dedicated to Enlightenment ideals, was recast as a demonic force in Nazi mythology. As German armies conquered Europe, the war against Freemasonry expanded beyond Germany's borders. In Austria, Czechoslovakia, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, and beyond, Masonic lodges were shut down almost immediately after occupation. The pattern was the same everywhere: raids, seizures, arrests, confiscation of property. In France, where Freemasonry had deep roots in Republican politics, Nazi authorities worked closely with collaborationist regimes to identify Masons. Lodge buildings were emptied, their contents shipped to Germany. By the height of the war, tens of thousands of Masonic objects had been stolen across Europe. Many would never be recovered. Although Freemasons were not targeted for extermination in the same way as Jews, Roma, or others, they were still victims of intense repression. Many Freemasons were arrested as political enemies. Some were sent to concentration camps, often categorized as political prisoners. Others disappeared quietly, fired from jobs, socially ostracized, or forced into silence. In Nazi camps, Freemasons were sometimes forced to wear identifying symbols, lumped together with other ideological enemies of the Reich. Their crime was belief in ideals incompatible with totalitarian rule. When Nazi Germany collapsed in 1945, Allied forces uncovered massive hidden caches of stolen cultural property. Among them were thousands of Masonic artifacts, packed into crates, hidden in mines, castles, and remote mountain depots. Some collections were recovered and eventually returned. Others had been destroyed in bombings, looted by retreating Nazis, or vanished into the black market. To this day, countless Masonic objects remain missing, their fate unknown. At its core, the Nazi war on Freemasonry was about control. Freemasonry encouraged independent thought, ethical debate, and loyalty beyond the state. It promoted brotherhood across national and religious lines. These ideas were intolerable to a regime built on obedience, exclusion, and racial supremacy. For the Nazi regime, the destruction of Freemasonry was not only physical, it was bureaucratic. Once lodges were raided and sealed, the Gestapo launched an exhaustive paper war. Membership lists were among the most prized seizures. These documents revealed names, professions, addresses, political affiliations, and social networks, exactly the kind of intelligence the Nazi police state craved. Former Freemasons were summoned for interrogation. Many were forced to explain their beliefs, their rituals, and their personal connections. Even those who had resigned decades earlier found themselves under suspicion. The Gestapo treated Masonic membership as a marker of ideological unreliability. Judges, teachers, civil servants, military officers, any past lodge affiliation could end a career instantly. In a regime obsessed with ideological purity, Freemasonry became a stain that could never fully be erased. Files compiled during these investigations followed individuals for years. Some Freemasons were later arrested not for lodge activity itself, but because these files marked them as potential enemies of the state. Paper became a weapon. As the physical looting continued, Nazi propaganda intensified its assault. Freemasonry was depicted in posters, pamphlets, exhibitions, and films as part of a vast, shadowy enemy network. Masonic symbols were deliberately distorted. The square and compass were merged with the Star of David. Lodge rituals were portrayed as occult ceremonies aimed at corrupting nations. In 1937, the Nazis organized propaganda exhibitions explicitly designed to expose Freemasonry. These displays showcased looted Masonic artifacts, aprons, ritual tools, books, arranged in sinister lighting and accompanied by fabricated explanations. To the average German citizen, this propaganda was convincing. Most people had never seen the inside of a lodge. Secrecy bred suspicion. The regime filled that vacuum with lies. Freemasonry was accused of orchestrating revolutions, manipulating financial systems, and engineering Germany's defeat in World War I. None of it was true. But truth had no place in Nazi ideology. The looted lodge objects were no longer cultural artifacts. They were props in a carefully staged performance of fear. No figure embodied the Nazi fixation on Freemasonry more than Heinrich Himmler. As head of the SS, Himmler viewed himself not merely as a security chief, but as the architect of a new spiritual order. He despised Freemasonry because it offered an alternative system of ritual, symbolism, and moral authority, one that was not under his control. Himmler believed that Freemasonry had stolen ancient Germanic traditions and corrupted them. He ordered SS researchers to strip Masonic rituals down to their symbolic core, searching for what he imagined were traces of ancient Aryan secrets. This obsession led to the creation of massive Masonic archives under SS supervision. Lodges across occupied Europe were looted not randomly, but selectively. Items deemed symbolically important were prioritized. Himmler wanted knowledge dominance. If Freemasonry possessed symbolic power, the SS would claim it or destroy it. As Allied bombing intensified, the Nazis began hiding their looted collections. Masonic artifacts were transported from cities to remote locations, medieval castles, abandoned monasteries, salt mines, and underground vaults. These places were chosen not only for protection, but for symbolism. Himmler favored locations steeped in myth and history. One of the most infamous storage sites was a salt mine complex, where crates containing thousands of stolen Masonic objects sat alongside looted Jewish religious items, artworks, and rare books. Each crate was meticulously labeled. Ironically, the same bureaucracy that destroyed Freemasonry preserved detailed records of its theft. Yet chaos reigned as the war turned against Germany. Some collections were lost during evacuations. Others were deliberately destroyed to prevent recovery. In some cases, retreating SS units looted the loot, stealing precious metals and artifacts for themselves. What survived did so by chance. While Freemasons were not targeted for genocide, many paid a terrible price. Some were imprisoned as political opponents. Others were arrested due to associations uncovered in seized lodge records. In concentration camps, Freemasons were often classified under political prisoner categories. Survivor testimonies describe Freemasons being interrogated repeatedly about lodge rituals and international connections. Guards demanded explanations for symbols they themselves did not understand. For some prisoners, Masonic ideals became a source of quiet resistance. Brotherhood, moral discipline, and mutual aid helped men survive conditions designed to strip them of humanity. Even in camps, Freemasonry lived on, not in ritual but in principle. In occupied Europe, the Nazi campaign against Freemasonry often relied on local collaborators. In Vichy France, authorities cooperated in identifying Freemasons, dismissing them from public office and confiscating lodge property. Similar patterns emerged in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway. Former lodge members were sometimes betrayed by neighbors, colleagues, or rivals seeking favor with the occupiers. Old membership lists became tools of revenge. Freemasonry's emphasis on fraternity could not protect it from fear and opportunism. As Allied armies advanced into Germany in 1944 and 1945, they uncovered evidence of the Nazi obsession with Freemasonry. Crates of Masonic artifacts appeared in castles and mines. Intelligence officers were puzzled by the sheer scale of the collections. Why had the Nazis devoted so much effort to looting aprons, books, and ceremonial tools? Only later did the full picture emerge. The Nazis had not looted Freemasonry for profit alone. They had looted it for control of ideas, history, and symbolic power. After the war, surviving Masonic organizations faced a painful reality. Entire lodge histories were gone, membership records destroyed or scattered, ritual objects lost forever. In many cases, no one even knew what had been taken. Allied restitution programs prioritized major artworks and Jewish property. Masonic claims often moved slowly, complicated by the fact that Freemasonry itself had been outlawed for over a decade. Some lodges rebuilt from memory alone, recreating regalia, rewriting rituals, and honoring brothers who never returned. Freemasonry survived, but it was forever changed. Even decades later, discoveries continue. Occasionally, Masonic artifacts surface in private collections, estate sales, or forgotten archives. Each find raises difficult questions. Who stole this? Who owns it now? Can it ever truly be returned? Some objects remain in museums, displayed without context. Others are still hidden, buried in forgotten Nazi depots or lost to time. The looting of the lodges is not a closed chapter. It is an unresolved one. At its heart, this story is not about aprons or rituals. It is about fear. The Nazis feared any system that encouraged independent thought, moral debate, and loyalty beyond the state. Freemasonry represented everything totalitarianism could not tolerate. That is why the lodges were looted. That is why the archives were seized. That is why symbols were demonized. The Nazis did not just want to defeat Freemasonry. They wanted to erase the idea that men could gather freely to think, question, and build a better world. The Third Reich collapsed, its archives burned, its leaders fell. Freemasonry endured. Though stripped of its buildings, looted of its treasures, and hunted into silence, the fraternity survived because its foundation was not physical, it was philosophical. The Nazis could steal objects. They could not steal ideas. By the late 1930s, the war against Freemasonry had become fully institutionalized within the Nazi state. Responsibility did not rest with a single office, but with a network of overlapping agencies. The Gestapo handled surveillance, arrests, and interrogations. The Reich Security Main Office coordinated intelligence gathering, but it was the SS, under Heinrich Himmler, that became the ideological engine of the campaign. Within the SS, special cultural and research units were tasked with cataloging enemy belief systems. Freemasonry was classified alongside Judaism, liberalism, and Christianity as a hostile worldview. Masonic artifacts were routed through SS channels, often ending up in research collections rather than destruction facilities. The goal was not merely suppression, it was domination of narrative. The SS wanted to define what Freemasonry had been and why it had to disappear. In Germany itself, the destruction was near total. Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, Frankfurt, and Leipzig all had active Masonic communities before 1933. By 1935, virtually every lodge had been dissolved. Buildings were seized and repurposed as Nazi offices, police stations, or propaganda halls. Raids followed a chillingly uniform pattern. Gestapo officers arrived with search warrants. Lodge leaders were detained. Safes were opened. Ritual halls were photographed. Symbols were removed and boxed. Libraries were stripped shelf by shelf. Some lodges attempted to hide their archives in private homes. Others buried regalia or entrusted items to sympathetic churches. These efforts rarely succeeded. Informants, surveillance, and coercion made secrecy impossible. By the end of the decade, German Freemasonry had been erased from public life. The annexation of Austria in 1938 triggered immediate repression. Vienna had been a major center of Freemasonry, with lodges dating back to the Enlightenment. Within days of the Anschluss, Nazi authorities moved against them. Lodge buildings were sealed, leaders were arrested, archives were seized intact, often before members could react. The speed of the crackdown revealed careful planning. Lists had already been prepared. Viennese Masonic collections were among the richest in Europe. Many artifacts were shipped directly to SS repositories in Germany. Others disappeared into private Nazi collections. For Austrian Freemasons, there was no transition period. One day they were citizens, the next they were enemies. In France, Freemasonry carried a unique political stigma. Because French lodges had historically supported republicanism, secularism, and democratic institutions, the Nazis portrayed them as architects of France's defeat. After the 1940 armistice, both German occupiers and the Vichy regime targeted Freemasons aggressively. Lodges were closed nationwide. Membership lists were published in collaborationist newspapers, exposing thousands of individuals to public shame and persecution. Masonic buildings in Paris, Lyon, Marseille, and Bordeaux were looted. Their contents were displayed in propaganda exhibitions, designed to humiliate the fraternity and justify repression. French Freemasonry suffered not only theft, but deliberate public degradation. In Belgium and the Netherlands, the Nazi approach combined efficiency with brutality. Lodges were raided using intelligence gathered before occupation. Archives were seized intact. In some cases, entire lodge collections were shipped directly to Germany within weeks. Norway's smaller Masonic community faced similar treatment. Lodges were shut down, leaders interrogated, and buildings confiscated. The Nazi regime viewed even small lodges as unacceptable centers of independent thought. Across Northern Europe, the pattern was unmistakable: immediate suppression, systematic looting, ideological framing. Chapter 25: Individual Stories, Brothers Under Pressure. Behind the statistics were individuals. Judges forced to resign, teachers dismissed overnight, military officers stripped of rank. Elderly lodge members interrogated about rituals they had practiced quietly for decades. Some Freemasons attempted to save others by falsely minimizing lodge activities. Others refused to cooperate and paid the price. A few destroyed membership lists themselves, choosing to sacrifice history to protect lives. These acts erased records, but saved people. Not all resistance was dramatic. Sometimes it was silence. Sometimes it was refusal to betray another name. The Nazis were obsessed with symbols, and nowhere was this clearer than in their treatment of Masonic imagery. The square and compass, the all-seeing eye, pillars, working tools, all were reinterpreted as signs of corruption. Nazi ideologues claimed these symbols concealed secret messages of domination. SS researchers produced absurd analyses linking Masonic symbols to ancient conspiracies. Charts, diagrams, and fabricated histories circulated within Nazi institutions. Symbols that once represented moral labor were weaponized into evidence of imagined treason. Although Hitler delegated much of the operational work, his hostility toward Freemasonry was unmistakable. He viewed it as an internationalist force undermining national unity. In his worldview, loyalty could belong only to the nation and the Führer, not to abstract moral principles. Freemasonry's emphasis on equality, fraternity, and enlightenment clashed directly with Nazi hierarchy and racial doctrine. To Hitler, Freemasonry was not weak. It was dangerous. As the Third Reich collapsed, the fate of looted Masonic collections became chaotic. Some SS units attempted to destroy archives to erase evidence. Others abandoned caches as Allied forces advanced. Opportunistic looting exploded. Crates were broken open, precious metals vanished, paper records were scattered or burned. By the time Allied recovery teams arrived, much was already lost. At the Nuremberg trials, Freemasonry received little attention. The scale of Nazi crimes was overwhelming. Genocide, aggressive war, mass murder. By comparison, cultural looting of Masonic lodges seemed secondary. As a result, few perpetrators were held accountable specifically for anti-Masonic persecution. Restitution claims languished in bureaucracy. Justice for Freemasonry was partial at best. After 1945, surviving Freemasons faced a monumental task. Lodges reopened in ruined cities. Rituals were reconstructed from memory. New regalia was crafted to replace what had been lost. Many lodges dedicated memorials to brothers who had died in camps, prisons, or exile. Silence gave way to remembrance. The fraternity emerged smaller, but resilient. The Nazi war on Freemasonry reveals something essential about totalitarianism. Authoritarian regimes do not fear armies alone. They fear independent networks. They fear private thought. They fear moral systems they cannot command. Freemasonry was targeted not because it wielded power, but because it represented autonomy. That made it intolerable. They broke the doors. They seized the books. They stole the symbols. But they never understood the thing they were trying to destroy. Freemasonry was not hidden in buildings or locked in safes. It lived in principles, in memory, in quiet acts of brotherhood. The Nazis could loot lodges. They could erase names from records. They could scatter centuries of history. What they could not do was extinguish the idea that free people can meet, think, and build a better world without permission. And that, more than any secret ritual, is why they were afraid.